Rain came down in sheets, turning the town's single muddy street into a swollen river that sucked at boots and swallowed wagon wheels. Lightning cracked above the rooftops, throwing the saloon's swinging doors into brief relief like the jaws of some beast coughing its prey onto the street. Finn Mercer pulled the brim of his hat low, rain running from its edge in steady rivulets that dampened the shoulders of his duster. His team of horses strained, heads bowed against the storm, as he guided the wagon slowly along the mire. Behind him, huddled beneath a patched canvas cover, his 3 girls clung to one another in silence, their small faces pale against the dim glow of a lantern. The storm had driven most folk indoors, yet a knot of men lingered outside the saloon, their voices slurred and loud even against the thunder. Finn would have passed by without a second glance. He knew better than to measure time near men who carried whiskey more faithfully than they carried God. But the sound of jeering caught his ear, followed by the sight of a figure being shoved from the saloon doors. She stumbled into the rain, her bare feet sinking into the muck, her dress once white, now gray with road dust and liquor stains. The woman's black hair was plastered to her face, her lips split, eyes wide in the lantern light. Chinese. Even before she raised her arms to shield her head from another shove, Finn understood what held the men's laughter so taut. She was foreign, unwelcome, branded different. He had seen this sort of cruelty before, when men sought to prove their worth not with labor or honesty, but with the breaking of someone weaker. One of the drunkards called her a curse, another grabbed her wrist and yanked her forward. She slipped in the mud and fell hard, a cry drowned by thunder. The girls stirred in the wagon, the youngest whimpering. Finn reined in the horses, his jaw set. He had not come to town for trouble, just for flour, nails, a spool of thread. But trouble had a way of finding those too small to fight it. He stepped down into the muck, boots sinking deep. His coat flared with the wind, and the lantern swayed above, catching the sharp lines of his face. He did not shout, nor curse, nor rush forward. He only walked, steady as a man crossing his own field. The men noticed him in time, laughter faltering as his shadow cut through the lamplight. "That one's ours," said the tallest, his words slurred, his grip on the woman's wrist tightening until her knuckles whitened. Finn's hand brushed the butt of the revolver at his hip, though he did not draw it. His voice, when he spoke, carried even through the storm, low, steady, iron. "Let her go." The tall man sneered, though unease flickered in his eyes. "Ain't your concern, Mercer. She's filth. No place for her in this town." Finn took another step, boots pulling free of the sucking mud with effort. He glanced at the woman. She was breathing fast, eyes darting between the men and him, like a rabbit caught between wolves and a hound she could not yet trust. "You heard me," Finn said. "Let her go." Silence stretched, broken only by the storm. The other men shifted, some muttering, one spitting into the mud. They all knew Finn Mercer, the widower who kept to himself, raising 3 girls on land too hard for one man. He was not quick to anger, not quick to speak. But when he planted his feet, even the weather seemed to pause. The tall man's grip faltered. With a shove, he let the woman stumble free. She fell again, knees striking mud, but this time no one laughed. Finn stepped closer, and the group parted, unease outweighing bravado. He reached down and lifted her gently by the arm. She was lighter than he expected, fragile beneath the sodden cloth, but she straightened with a stubbornness that reminded him of wheat stalks that bent in the wind yet refused to break. He guided her toward the wagon. His daughters' faces peered from beneath the canvas, wide-eyed, silent, their braids damp against their cheeks. The woman froze when she saw them, shame flickering across her face as if she had no right to stand near children. "Up you go," Finn said quietly. She shook her head, rain streaming down her face, lips parting as if to protest. But the men were watching, and she swayed on her feet, too weak to argue long. Finn placed his hands firmly at her waist and lifted her onto the wagon bench. She trembled but did not resist. The men muttered, one cursing under his breath, another spitting again as if to cleanse the sight. Finn climbed back onto the wagon, gathered the reins, and with a sharp click of his tongue, urged the horses forward. Wheels churned through muck, splattering rain and dirt behind them. For several moments, the only sound was storm and hoofbeats. The woman sat rigid beside him, hands clenched in her lap, eyes fixed ahead. He did not speak, nor did she. The girls huddled close, stealing glances at her, curiosity warring with unease. The road out of town grew darker, the lanterns behind them swallowed by rain. Finn kept the horses steady, though his mind tightened around what he had just done. He had brought a stranger into his wagon, a woman unwanted by the town, with a past that would soon stir talk. Yet when he had seen her fall, something in him, something that had hardened years ago when fever took his wife, refused to stand idle. The wagon creaked beneath the weight of silence. At last, the youngest girl, barely 5, whispered, "Papa." Finn glanced back. She was pointing at the woman, eyes round. He met his daughter's gaze, then turned to the woman. "She'll ride with us," he said simply. The girl nodded, satisfied, and nestled against her sisters again. The woman exhaled shakily, though she kept her eyes forward. Finn noticed her fingers working the fabric of her dress, as if stitching invisible seams to hold herself together. By the time they reached the ranch, the storm had swollen into a roar. The house loomed out of the darkness, weathered boards groaning under wind, smoke long since blown from the chimney. Finn reined the horses into the shed, unhitching with practiced hands while the rain lashed his back. When he returned to the wagon, the woman had gathered the children beneath the canvas, shielding them as best she could from the downpour. It startled him, the instinct, so quick, so natural. Inside, the house smelled of damp wood and ashes gone cold. Finn struck a match, the flame trembling before catching the wick of a lantern. Warm light spread across the room, chasing shadows. He gestured for the girls to settle near the hearth, then fetched kindling. Soon, the fire crackled, throwing sparks against the blackened stone. The woman lingered near the door, water pooling at her feet. She looked smaller in the light, her dress clinging to her frame, her face pale yet resolute. Finn motioned toward the hearth. "Warm yourself." She hesitated, then crossed the room, every step cautious, as though she expected the floor itself to betray her. She knelt near the fire, holding her hands toward the heat. Steam rose from her sleeves. The girls inched closer, their suspicion dulled by exhaustion and the comfort of warmth. Finn watched from the shadows, leaning against the wall. He had not planned for this night, nor for the storm that carried her to his door. Yet the sight of her sitting among his daughters, firelight softening the harshness carved into her features, struck him with a quiet weight. She did not belong to the jeering men, nor to the mud that had swallowed her dignity. Not any more. Outside, the storm howled, rattling shutters and shaking the roof. Inside, silence held, save for the hiss of rain and the crackle of fire. The girls' eyes grew heavy, their heads drooping one by one onto the hearthrug. The woman sat still, watching them, lips trembling with something unspoken. Finn crossed the room, set a kettle near the flames, and crouched beside the sleeping children. His hand brushed his youngest's damp hair from her face, then lingered near the woman's shoulder. He did not touch her, but the gesture was enough to draw her gaze. Their eyes met, hers haunted, his steady. For a moment, no words passed. None were needed. Thunder boomed again, closer than before, shaking the walls. The woman flinched, eyes darting to the door as if expecting it to burst open. Finn followed her gaze, his own features tightening. He had pulled her from the hands of drunken men, but he knew cruelty did not end with one night. There would be whispers, resentment, maybe worse. The firelight flickered, casting their shadows against the wall, his tall and rigid, hers small but unbroken. The storm pressed close around the house, as though testing the walls for weakness. Finn straightened slowly, eyes still on the door. Something in his chest, heavy and familiar, stirred, the knowledge that the trouble he had brought home would not wash away with the rain. And yet, as he looked back at the woman, who now brushed a stray lock of hair from his eldest's sleeping face with the gentlest of touches, he felt the weight shift. Not all storms were meant to be shut out. Some came to test what still stood. The wind howled, the fire hissed, and in the fragile quiet between, Finn Mercer understood. The night's rescue had only begun. The rain did not let up for 3 days. It came in long, silver cords, drumming against the roof until the shingles wept and trickled through the cracks in the walls. The Mercer Ranch became an island adrift in a gray ocean. The fields blurred into swampland, the fences sagged, and the dirt road that led toward town vanished into a river of clay and mud. Inside, the house breathed dampness, wet wood, wool, and smoke that fought stubbornly against the storm's chill. Finn rose early as always, chopping kindling beneath the eaves, his coat plastered to his back. Each swing of the axe sent steam rising from his shoulders, and when he returned, boots dripping, he found her awake at the hearth. The Chinese woman knelt with her sleeves rolled, stoking the fire. She had dried her hair, though dark strands still clung to her cheekbones, and she moved with the deliberate precision of one who had learned to make herself small in another's home. Finn paused in the doorway, rain dripping from his hat brim, watching her tend the flames as though they were something sacred. She turned, startled, and lowered her gaze. He noticed the small pouch of rice at her side, tied with twine, the only possession she seemed to carry. She held it to her chest protectively before tucking it back into her dress. "I'll see to the chores," Finn said, hanging his coat and setting the axe aside. His voice was rough with sleep and cold. She nodded quickly, rising to her feet. Then, after a hesitation, she gestured toward the iron pot by the hearth. Steam curled from it, carrying a scent unlike anything Finn's kitchen had known, something faint, earthy, warm. She ladled the water over a small handful of rice and set it aside with 3 wooden bowls. The girls woke one by one, rubbing their eyes. The youngest toddled toward the hearth, curiosity outweighing fear, and the woman bent to meet her, offering a spoonful of softened grain. The child accepted it, her lips sticky with starch, and smiled. The woman returned the smile, though hers trembled as if unused to being worn. The other 2 lingered, cautious, but hunger coaxed them closer. Soon all 3 huddled near her, passing the bowl between them, their laughter beginning to creep into the edges of the storm's hum. Finn stood with arms folded, watching the scene unfold. His girls, who had cried themselves to sleep too many nights, now pressed their shoulders against a stranger's sleeve as if she had always been there. The woman caught his gaze briefly before looking down, as though ashamed of overstepping. Finn cleared his throat, busying himself with the tools on the table, though inside something eased. Days bled together. The storm sealed them inside, giving no choice but to share the same air, the same labor, the same silences. Finn repaired the fence posts in the barn when the weather allowed. When it didn't, he sat at the table sharpening knives, the rasp of steel against stone steady and patient. The woman, Jing Lin, he learned at last when the youngest tugged at her sleeve and she answered in a whisper, kept herself busy with the girls. She patched worn skirts with needle and thread so fine Finn thought it the work of some tailor. She braided hair with deft fingers, humming low songs that carried a lilt foreign yet soothing. She moved quietly, as if she expected to be scolded for each gesture, yet the house filled slowly with traces of her. Steam rising from herbs she brewed, the soft cadence of her lullabies, the scent of cloth scrubbed clean with rainwater and soap. The girls thawed in her presence. The middle child followed her like a shadow, mimicking her motions as she stirred the pot or hung laundry near the fire. The eldest watched longest, suspicion lingering, but even she began to ask questions. Small at first, like how to tie a braid tighter, or whether rice could be planted in the soil outside. Finn observed quietly. He was not a man for excess words, and silence often stretched long in the house. But the silence was no longer hollow. It was thick with the rhythm of breath, the scrape of bowls, the rustle of cloth, and the soft murmur of girls who no longer seemed as frightened of storms. One evening, as the rain lessened to a steady drizzle, Finn sat by the table oiling his revolver. Jing knelt near the hearth, her hair glowing bronze in the firelight. The girls lay curled on the rug, their chests rising and falling in sleep. Finn glanced toward the woman and found her watching the flames, her face bare of the guarded expression she so often carried. For a fleeting second, she looked not like an outcast or a wanderer, but like any mother watching children she loved. He set the revolver down. His voice broke the hush, low and even. "You'll stay here. Safer than town." She looked up sharply, lips parting as though to protest. He met her gaze, his features unmoving, but his eyes carried something steadier than command. He had seen the way she shielded the girls without thought, how she gave them her portion of rice, how she stitched their sleeves until her fingers ached. She belonged here more than any of the men who had shoved her into the mud. She swallowed, her voice soft, almost fragile. "They won't accept me." "I don't care what they accept," Finn said. Silence followed, heavy with things neither dared speak. Jing lowered her eyes again, but her hand drifted toward the rug, brushing against the smallest girl's hair in a gesture that lingered longer than necessity. The days wore on, the storm tapering into drizzle, then fog. The land outside looked sodden, beaten flat, but alive. Grass bent low with water, cattle stirred restlessly in the pen, and the creek roared with a fullness it had not carried in months. Finn took Jing and the girls outside one afternoon to gather firewood left sodden near the shed. She wrapped herself in one of his coats, sleeves too long, hem dragging through the mud. The girls giggled at the sight, tugging at her hands as though she had been claimed as their own. Finn watched from a distance, stacking wood with deliberate motions, but every so often his eyes strayed toward her, watching the way her laughter, shy at first, grew freer as the children pulled her along. That night, with the fire burning high and the smell of pine needles clinging to their clothes, Finn spoke again. His words came slow, like stones drawn from a riverbed. "I need a mother for my girls." He paused, eyes fixed on the flames. "And you need shelter." Jing froze. The girls had fallen asleep again, their heads pillowed on her lap. Her hand stilled where it smoothed their hair. His voice carried no poetry, no soft edges. It was a statement, blunt as timber. Yet beneath it lay something raw, an emptiness worn too long. She stared at him, lips trembling, eyes dark pools that reflected the firelight. She wanted to argue, to say she had nothing left to give, that she was broken soil, not fit for planting. But the warmth of 3 small bodies against her skirt betrayed her. She belonged nowhere else. Her reply came not as words but as a slow nod, her chin dipping once before her gaze fell to the fire. Finn did not smile, nor soften. But he exhaled, shoulders loosening in a way she had not seen before, and for him it was more than any grin. After that night, something shifted. The chores became shared without need for command. She swept while he mended tack, she cooked while he gathered eggs, she hushed the girls when thunder startled them while he checked the shutters. Their rhythms wove together, not with declarations but with unspoken agreement, as if the house itself had decided it would no longer stand hollow. Yet shadows lingered. Finn noticed the way she started at sudden noises, the way her eyes darted to the window whenever a rider passed along the far road. At night, when she thought him asleep, he heard her whispering in her native tongue, words pressed between prayer and memory. One evening, as dusk bled red across the fields and the storm clouds pulled apart to reveal a bruised sky, Finn caught her outside, wringing water from the laundry. Her hands were raw, her knuckles split, yet she worked without pause. He stepped close, reached for the line, and together they pinned the sheets in silence. When their hands brushed, neither pulled away quickly enough. Her fingers were cold, his calloused, but for a heartbeat they lingered, the fabric whipping between them in the evening wind. She looked up, eyes wide, lips parting as though to speak, but thunder growled again from the horizon, and she turned away, retreating inside. Finn stood alone with the damp sheets, heart beating with a weight he had not felt since before fever stole his wife. He knew then that what he had offered her, shelter, necessity, was already bending into something deeper. That night, as rain began again in light drizzle, the girls crowded close to Jing, their arms tangled around her waist as though they had never known life without her. Finn sat by the fire, watching. When her eyes met his, neither spoke, but the distance between them felt narrower, filled with a heat that was no longer just from the flames. The house creaked with wind, shadows shifted along the walls, and the storm whispered that safety was only a borrowed thing. Finn's gaze lingered on the door, unease stirring. Somewhere beyond the drenched horizon, men with whiskey and hatred still remembered her face. And when thunder rolled again, heavier this time, it sounded less like weather and more like a warning. The storm had passed, leaving the land heavy with silence. Water clung to every blade of grass, every fence post, every branch bowed with weight. The Mercer ranch smelled of soaked earth and pine smoke, a mixture that seemed both cleansing and foreboding. Finn rose before dawn, as always, tending to the cattle while the girls still slept. When he returned, he found Jing awake at the hearth, mending the eldest's torn skirt with fingers quick and sure. Her hair, dark and straight, fell over her shoulders in the early light, and for the first time Finn noticed how it gleamed like wet ink against the faded calico of her borrowed dress. She did not look up until he set the pail of milk on the table. Her eyes flickered to his, wary, then lowered again to her work. It had been that way since the first night. She accepted his presence but never sought it, carrying herself like someone who believed her right to exist might be revoked at any moment. The day wore on quietly. Jing gathered herbs in the yard, drying them carefully near the window, their bitter scent curling through the room. The girls followed her like shadows, asking questions she answered with simple gestures. How to press leaves to ease a bruise, how to braid grass into a cord. Finn watched from the porch, his pipe unlit between his fingers. He knew she carried something heavy, a past that made her flinch when riders passed on the far road. That evening, after the girls had been put to bed, the truth slipped free. She sat by the fire, her hands folded in her lap, her face bare in the flickering light. Finn sat across from her, sharpening his knife on a whetstone, the steady rasp filling the silence. At last, she spoke, her voice low, almost drowned by the crackle of flames. "I was sold," she said, the words flat, practiced. "Brought from California. Promised as a bride to a miner." Finn set the knife aside, the stone still warm from his hand. He did not interrupt. "He died after one winter. Sickness." She drew in a breath, the firelight catching the tremor of her lips. "His friends said I was cursed. No one would feed me, no one would keep me. They tried to sell me again. Not as a wife this time." Her eyes flicked to his, then away. "I ran." Silence stretched. Outside, the wind stirred the wet leaves, carrying the faint scent of rain. Finn leaned forward, forearms braced on his knees. "You've carried that alone." His voice was low, not a question but a recognition. Jing's eyes glistened. She nodded once, lips pressed tight, as though admitting it aloud was itself a kind of defeat. Finn did not speak comfort. He was not a man who knew the language of soft reassurances. Instead, he reached for the kettle, poured her a cup of hot water, and set it near her hands. She blinked at the steam rising from it, then curled her fingers around the clay. For a moment, her shoulders eased. The next day brought signs of unease. A rider came by at midday, his horse kicking mud up the road. He reined in at the gate, hat pulled low, eyes sharp. Finn stepped out to meet him, rifle resting casual across his arm though the man had made no threat. "Heard tell you're keeping company with a foreign bride," the rider said, his voice edged with disdain. "Men in town are riled. Say it ain't fitting." Finn's jaw hardened. "My house, my land. Who I keep is my business." The rider spat into the dirt, eyeing the windows where the girls' faces peeked through the curtains. "Best be careful. Folks don't take kindly. They're saying she ought to be turned over, sent back to where she came from." Finn said nothing, only stood with the rifle balanced easy in his grip until the man shifted in his saddle and rode off, leaving the smell of horse sweat and threat behind. That evening, Jing sensed the change. She watched Finn more closely, reading the tightness in his shoulders, the way he checked the latches twice, how his eyes lingered longer on the horizon. When the girls had gone to bed, she approached him cautiously, her hands twisting together. "They will come," she whispered. "Men like them, they don't forget." Finn looked at her, steady. "Then let them come." She searched his face for bravado, but found none. His tone carried no boast, no fury, only a weight of certainty that unsettled her more than anger could have. She turned away, pacing near the window, pressing her fingers to the glass as if she could push the world outside farther from the walls. The days narrowed with tension. Finn taught his eldest how to load the smaller rifle, her hands shaking but determined. He walked the perimeter of the property at dusk, boots sinking in mud, eyes scanning the tree line for movement. Jing began storing food quietly, drying herbs more urgently, pressing them into jars that she tucked beneath the floorboards. At night, when the girls slept tangled together on the rug, Finn found Jing sitting by the fire, her posture taut, her eyes distant. Once, she began speaking in Chinese, the words soft and rhythmic. When he asked what she said, she shook her head. "A prayer," she whispered, "for strength." One evening, as he mended tack at the table, Finn broke the silence. "My wife died of fever," he said, voice steady though the memory carved lines deeper into his face. "I buried her out back under the oak. Girls were too young to remember her right. I've done what I can since, but—" He paused, running the cloth slow across the leather strap. "A house can't be whole with pieces missing." Jing looked up from the fire, her eyes reflecting sorrow and recognition. She said nothing, but her hand drifted unconsciously toward the sleeping children, resting lightly against their hair. The next morning, a neighbor rode hard to the ranch, breath steaming in the cold air. He pulled Finn aside, his face grim. "Men are talking about a reckoning. Say they'll come at night. Too many to face alone." Finn's gaze did not flinch. "When?" "Soon. Storm's brewing again. They'll use it to cover their tracks." Finn nodded once, sending the man off with thanks. He returned to the house, where Jing stood at the door, her eyes searching his face. She already knew, though he hadn't spoken. "They want me," she said. "They won't take you," he replied. Her lips parted as if to argue, but the steel in his voice stopped her. She turned instead to the girls, who were laughing over a game of stones on the floor. Their innocence pressed against her chest like a blade. That night, Jing told Finn more. She spoke of the journey from China, of hunger that bent bones, of nights when she thought she would vanish like mist on the sea. She spoke of the miner who had bought her, who had treated her not unkindly, yet whose death left her abandoned like an unwanted tool. She spoke of the jeers, the hands that had tried to claim her, the flight into the storm that brought her to his wagon. Her words came halting, broken, but Finn did not interrupt. He only listened, the firelight throwing shadows across his face. When at last her voice failed, he said quietly, "You're not what they say you are." She closed her eyes, the weight of his certainty sinking into her bones. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe it might be true. But belief could not stop what waited beyond the fields. As the week waned, the sky darkened once more, clouds rolling heavy and low, thunder whispering on the horizon. The girls sensed the unease, clinging closer to Jing's skirts, their laughter subdued. Finn checked the rifles again, his motions practiced, steady. Jing ground herbs into powder, her hands trembling though her jaw stayed set. When their eyes met across the room, no words passed, but both understood. The storm outside was not the only one they would weather. The air thickened with the smell of rain, with the charge of lightning still unborn. The cattle lowed uneasily in the distance. Finn stood at the door as the first drops fell, his shoulders broad, his face unreadable, his hand resting on the rifle at his side. Behind him, Jing gathered the girls near the hearth, their small bodies pressed close. She whispered in her native tongue, her voice a thread of calm against the rumble outside. And when the thunder cracked, closer than before, Finn glanced back once more. Her eyes met his, fear and defiance tangled, and in that moment both understood the truth. The men who threatened would come soon, and when they did, their fragile shelter would be tested to its breaking point. The rain returned with a vengeance, heavier than before, sweeping across the prairie in gray sheets that blurred the line between earth and sky. Thunder rolled in long, low growls, and each flash of lightning stretched shadows across the Mercer ranch house like talons reaching for its walls. Finn stood at the door with his rifle balanced in his hands, his eyes fixed on the horizon where lantern lights bobbed through the storm. They came slowly, 5 riders at first, but others followed, dark figures moving against the rain, voices raised in cruel laughter that carried despite the weather. Inside, the girls pressed close to Jing by the hearth. She wrapped her arms around them, whispering soft words in Chinese, syllables that rolled like prayer and comfort. Her face was pale but steady, her eyes flicking once toward Finn, who had not moved from the door. The riders drew closer. Lanterns swung wildly in their fists, casting grotesque shapes on the wet ground. One of them called out, voice thick with whiskey, "Mercer, send her out. She don't belong here, and you know it." Finn's jaw tightened, but he did not answer. He adjusted his grip on the rifle, the wood slick with rain dripping from his coat. Lightning flashed again, illuminating his face, stoic, unreadable, carved from stone. Another voice rose. "You'll bring shame on this town, keeping her here. Step aside, or we'll do it our way." Finn finally spoke, his voice steady as the storm's heartbeat. "My land. My house. You'll not cross my door." A murmur rippled through the group. Then came laughter, harsh and broken. "One man and a handful of children won't stop us." Jing flinched at the words, her arms tightening around the girls. She wanted to call out, to beg Finn not to risk himself, but her throat locked. She could only watch as he stepped onto the porch, rain streaming down his face, his figure broad and defiant against the lantern light. The men dismounted, boots splashing in mud. They fanned out in a semicircle, rifles slung, pistols glinting. The air reeked of wet leather and whiskey. Finn lifted his rifle, calm, deliberate. "Go home," he said. "You don't want this fight." For a moment, silence held, the storm raging around them. Then a shot cracked through the night. Splinters burst from the porch, railing inches from Finn's arm. The girls screamed. Jing rose instinctively, pulling them back from the hearth. Finn fired in return, his shot shattering the lantern held by one of the men. Darkness swallowed half the group, leaving only lightning to reveal their shapes. Chaos erupted, gunfire, shouting, boots stomping through mud. Finn ducked low, firing with precision, his body moving with practiced steadiness that belied the storm inside him. Two men rushed the porch. Finn swung the rifle like a club, knocking one back into the mud, his breath a sharp grunt. The other grappled with him, fists striking, rain mixing with sweat and blood. Finn shoved him hard against the railing, the wood groaning beneath their weight. Inside, Jing dragged the girls toward the corner, shielding them with her body. But when the door burst open, and a man stumbled in, dripping and snarling, she did not cower. Grabbing the nearest thing, a burning lantern from the mantel, she hurled it at him. Flames licked across his coat, and he staggered back into the storm with a scream, rain hissing as it smothered fire from cloth. The eldest girl, trembling but fierce, scrambled to the window, clutching the smaller rifle Finn had taught her to load. Her hands shook, but she pulled the trigger. The shot rang wild, sparking against the dirt near the attacker's boots. The sound startled them, breaking their advance, and for an instant the men faltered, realizing the house was no longer defended by one man alone. Finn, seizing the moment, drove the butt of his rifle into his opponent's chest, sending him sprawling into the mud. His breath came ragged, but his eyes burned with resolve. He stepped down from the porch into the storm, standing between the men and the house. "Last warning," he growled, his voice carrying through thunder. "But hatred does not bow easily." The leader sneered, pistol raised. "She's not worth your blood, Mercer." Finn leveled his rifle. "She's worth more than yours." They stared across the storm, two figures caught in lightning's glare. Then, with a cry, the leader charged, pistol cracking. Finn fired at the same instant. The shot split the night, echoing across the soaked fields. The leader stumbled, dropped his weapon, and fell face-first into the mud, the lantern rolling from his hand to sputter in the rain. The others froze. For a moment, only thunder spoke. Then, muttering curses, the men scrambled to their horses. Fear broke through their drunken rage, and one by one they rode off into the storm, their shapes swallowed by the curtain of rain. Finn stood in the mud, chest heaving, rifle still raised though the field had emptied. Lightning flared one last time, illuminating him alone, broad shoulders, rain washing blood from his brow, his figure unbroken against the storm. Inside, the girls clung to Jing, trembling but alive. She held them tight, her breath uneven, her face damp with sweat and tears she had not realized were falling. When Finn stepped back into the house, dripping and weary, she rose slowly. Their eyes met across the small room, the fire crackling low behind her. He set the rifle aside, his hands shaking faintly now that the danger had passed. The girls broke from Jing and ran to him, clinging to his legs, their sobs muffled against his coat. He crouched, gathering them close, his arms wrapping around all three with a strength that shook. Jing stood still, her hands pressed to her chest. She had been called cursed, worthless, unfit. Yet tonight, when the storm came, she had stood with him, and together they had turned the tide. The thought burned through her, terrifying and beautiful. When the girls finally released him, Finn looked up at her. His eyes, usually hard, now held a softness she had not seen. He rose, slow and heavy, and stepped closer. The firelight flickered across his face, casting deep shadows, but his voice was quiet, stripped of armor. "This house was hollow," he said. "Till you." Her breath caught. She wanted to answer, but no words formed. Instead, she reached for his hand. Their fingers brushed, hesitant at first, then steadier, clasping in silence. Outside, the storm began to ease. The rain slackened to a whisper, the thunder rolling farther away. Dawn hinted on the horizon, a faint light bleeding through the clouds. The ranch, battered and soaked, stood tall, smoke curling from its chimney like a flag of survival. The girls, exhausted, drifted to sleep against the hearth, their small bodies finally at peace. Finn and Jing remained standing, their hands joined, the fire's glow painting them in warmth the storm could not extinguish. For the first time since she had been cast into the mud, Jing did not feel like a shadow. She felt seen, held, chosen. And in Finn's steady gaze, she found not shelter alone, but belonging. The door rattled once with the last gust of wind, then stilled. Finn squeezed her hand, and together they turned toward the quiet dawn. The world beyond their walls remained cruel, but within them, something unshakable had been forged. The prairie breathed again, heavy with rain, cleansed of fire and fury. Yet in that calm, they both knew the fight was not over. Men nursed grudges like whiskey, and storms always returned. Still, when Jing looked at Finn, his daughters safe in the nest of their home, she understood a truth stronger than fear. They would face whatever came, side by side. And when the first ray of sunlight pierced the clouds, gilding the wet earth in gold, it seemed less a sunrise and more a promise, that the hollow house had been remade, not by wood or stone, but by the courage of two outcasts who chose to stand together.